On the evening of April 21, 2022, inside Texas's Huntsville unit, Carl Wayne Bunchen lay strapped to a gurney. At exactly 6:39 p.m., the state of Texas carried out his execution by lethal injection. He was 78 years old, the oldest person ever executed by the state, convicted of murdering a Houston police officer in a crime that had shaken the city in 1990. The wait had been agonizing. 31 years, 7 months, and 25 days since Officer James Irby was gunned down during a routine traffic stop. Now, as Bunchen lay waiting for the lethal drugs to flow, Maura Irby sat behind the glass, watching her husband's killer take his last breaths. For her, it was not closure, but the final chapter of a nightmare that had consumed half her lifetime. The man on the gurney bore little resemblance to the violent criminal who had executed a police officer in 1990. Bunchen was now a frail, wheelchair-bound elderly man suffering from arthritis, vertigo, sciatic nerve pain, and chronic illnesses. Just days before his execution, he had contracted pneumonia and suffered a head injury during transport. His lawyers had argued that executing such a physically deteriorated man would constitute cruel and unusual punishment, that the state would essentially be killing a different person than the one who committed the crime. Outside the prison walls, dozens of motorcycle engines roared in tribute to the fallen officer. Houston police officers, both active and retired, revved their bikes in a thunderous salute that echoed through the execution chamber. The sound was deafening, disrespectful to some, but perfectly fitting to others who remembered June 27, 1990. The murder that brought Bunchen here was execution style. James Irby, 37, had pulled over a car for a minor traffic violation. Without warning, without provocation, Bunchen stepped out and fired a .357 revolver into the officer's head. As Irby collapsed, dying, Bunchen walked around and shot him twice more in the back. 3 shots. 3 decades of appeals. 1 inevitable ending. For prosecutors, the case had always been clear. Multiple witnesses, the murder weapon recovered, Bunchen caught at the scene. By 1991, he was sentenced to die. For Bunchen, the years that followed were spent fighting the system, claiming self-defense, and watching his body deteriorate while his legal options dwindled. His defenders argued that 30 years of solitary confinement had already exacted a punishment worse than death, and that executing a man who could barely walk served no purpose of justice or deterrence. But as the end came, Bunchen's words carried unexpected remorse. "I wanted the Irby family to know one thing. I do have remorse for what I did," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I pray to God that they get the closure for me killing their father and Miss Irby's husband." To his spiritual advisor, he whispered prayers. To his friends who had supported him, he said simply, "I am ready to go to heaven, Warden." His last meal had been modest. His final words carried both accountability and faith. He acknowledged his guilt, spoke of redemption, and prepared to meet his Maker. At 6:39 p.m., the chemicals entered his veins. 13 minutes later, it was over. But to understand the real truth of how a 46-year-old career criminal became the oldest face of Texas justice, and why legal experts debated whether executing a frail elderly man crossed the line from justice into vengeance, we have to go back. Back to June 27, 1990. Back to Airline Drive and Lyerly Street. Back to the very beginning of Carl Wayne Bunchen. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. The darkest corners of human decision, broken down into tiny pieces so you can see every detail and make your own conclusions better. Carl Wayne Bunchen entered the world on March 30, 1944, alongside his twin brother Kenneth. But their childhood would be far from ordinary. The house where Carl and Kenneth grew up was ruled by fear and violence. His father dominated the family through brutal physical abuse that left lasting scars on every member of the household. The violence Carl witnessed went beyond typical domestic abuse. His father once murdered a man in front of one of his children, forcing the family to live with the horrific knowledge of what he was capable of. Carl's mother suffered her own torment. In one particularly violent incident, his father smashed her teeth. The abuse Carl endured was systematic and severe. He sustained multiple broken bones from his father's beatings, trauma that would later be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. The family lived in poverty, struggling to meet basic needs. Carl often ran away from home, finding refuge working on a dairy farm where he earned room and board. These escapes provided temporary relief from the chaos at home, but the damage was already taking root. The constant exposure to violence was shaping Carl's understanding of how conflicts were resolved. By the time Carl reached adolescence, the pattern was set. One of his brothers would eventually serve a 20-year prison sentence for an unrelated crime, showing how the cycle of violence and criminal behavior had infected the entire family. But it was the fate of his twin brother Kenneth that would later drive Carl toward his most violent act. Carl's first conviction came in 1961 for theft, marking the beginning of a criminal career that would span decades. While Carl Wayne Bunchen was learning to survive in a world of violence, James Bruce Irby was growing up in a completely different Houston. Born into a family with a tradition of public service, James inherited more than just his grandfather's name. He inherited his sense of duty. James's grandfather, V.V. Irby Sr., had served as a Houston Police Department officer, and when James joined the force, he was able to wear badge number 189, the same badge his grandfather had worn with pride. This wasn't just coincidence. It represented a family legacy of service and protection that would define James's career. James attended Gulfcrest Elementary School and Hartman Junior High School in Houston, showing himself to be a steady, reliable student. He graduated from Jones High School in June 1972, and by November of that same year, he had already made his decision about his future. At just 20 years old, James joined the Houston Police Department as a police trainee, beginning what would become an 18-year career in law enforcement. He entered Police Cadet Class number 57, graduating on March 3, 1973. On September 15, 1973, he successfully completed his probationary period and became a full officer. His first assignment was to the Point Control Division, where he learned the fundamentals of police work. In 1975, James transferred to Radio Patrol Central, expanding his experience and showing his willingness to take on different challenges within the department. By 1982, James had found his calling as a solo motorcycle officer. This was dangerous work that required skill, confidence, and quick reflexes. Motorcycle officers were often the first responders to accidents and emergencies, and they handled a significant portion of traffic enforcement throughout the city. James embraced this role and became known for his professionalism and dedication. Meanwhile, Carl Bunchen's path was taking him in the opposite direction. By the 1980s, he had accumulated multiple convictions for burglary, property damage, and drug possession. His criminal record was extensive, showing a pattern of escalating offenses and an inability to maintain a law-abiding life. By the mid-1980s, James Irby had established himself as a respected member of the Houston Police Department, but his personal life was about to take an unexpected turn. Despite his dangerous profession, James was known for his warm personality and genuine care for others. Maura Mills was a hospital trauma nurse who had made a firm decision about her personal life. She would never date a police officer, let alone marry one. She understood the dangers and stresses that came with law enforcement, and she didn't want that uncertainty in her life. But life has a way of changing our carefully made plans. James's friends knew he was interested in Maura, and they made sure the two crossed paths. When they finally met, James's persistent but respectful pursuit gradually won her over. I knew a bunch of his friends, and they introduced me, and he just kept flirting with me, Maura would later recall. Despite her reservations about dating a police officer, she found herself drawn to James's character and genuine nature. Their relationship developed into something deeper than either had expected. We were just crazy about each other, Maura remembered. James had found someone who understood the importance of helping others. Her work as a trauma nurse meant she spent her days saving lives, just as he spent his protecting the community. They married, and their happiness was complete when they started their family. In 1987, their son Cody James Irby was born, followed by daughter Callie Ann Irby in 1989. By 1990, James had been contemplating a major life change. After 17 years with the Houston Police Department, he was thinking about retirement. The timing felt right. His children were young, and he wanted to be the kind of father who could attend every ball game and every father-daughter dance. In May 1990, James actually submitted his retirement paperwork, but retirement would have to wait. The paperwork was filed, but James continued working while the transition was processed. He remained on patrol, still wearing badge 189, still committed to protecting the community he had served faithfully for so many years. What no one could have predicted was that his commitment to duty would put him in the path of a man whose life had taken a very different trajectory. Carl Wayne Bunchan's criminal history reached a horrific milestone in the late 1980s when he was convicted of sexually assaulting a teenage girl. The crime was serious enough to warrant a 15-year prison sentence, which should have kept him off the streets until the mid-2000s. However, the Texas prison system in the late 1980s and early 1990s was facing a crisis that would have fatal consequences. Prison overcrowding had reached critical levels throughout the state. Facilities designed to house specific numbers of inmates were being pushed far beyond their capacity. This overcrowding created dangerous conditions for both inmates and staff, and it put enormous pressure on the entire correctional system. The state's solution was to implement early release programs that would reduce the prison population to manageable levels. Carl Bunchan became one of the beneficiaries of this system failure. Despite being sentenced to 15 years for sexually assaulting a child, he served only 13 months before being released on parole in April 1990. This meant that a violent predator who should have remained incarcerated for more than a decade was back on the streets. The early release came with conditions, as all paroles do. Bunchan was required to report regularly to his parole officer, maintain employment, and avoid any illegal activity. These conditions weren't suggestions. They were legally binding requirements that, if violated, would result in his immediate return to prison. But from the very beginning, Bunchan showed no intention of complying with the terms of his release. Within weeks of his release, Bunchan failed to report to his parole officer as required. This violation should have triggered an immediate response from the parole system. A warrant should have been issued for his arrest, and law enforcement should have been notified to locate and apprehend him. But the system that had failed to keep him in prison in the first place also failed to monitor him properly once he was released. For 30 days, Bunchan roamed free, while authorities remained unaware that he had violated his parole conditions. By June 1990, Bunchan had been free for 2 months and in violation of his parole for several weeks, yet he remained on the streets of Houston, undetected by authorities. June 27, 1990, started like any other day for Houston police officer James Irby. He was working his regular patrol on his motorcycle, handling traffic enforcement, and responding to calls throughout his assigned area. At the intersection of Airline Drive and Lyerly Street, Officer Irby observed a traffic violation. It was routine police work, the kind of stop he had made thousands of times during his 17-year career. He activated his emergency lights and pulled over a Pontiac sedan that was traveling with 2 occupants. The driver of the vehicle was 42-year-old John Earl Killingsworth. In the passenger seat sat 46-year-old Carl Wayne Bunchan, who was carrying a .357 revolver and nursing a growing paranoia about his parole status. Unknown to Officer Irby, the trunk of the car contained heroin, and Bunchan was convinced that a warrant had been issued for his arrest due to his parole violations. Officer Irby approached the vehicle following standard protocol. He walked up to the driver's side and began speaking with Killingsworth about the traffic violation. This was routine procedure, professional, non-threatening, and focused on resolving the traffic matter quickly and safely. Irby had no reason to suspect that he was dealing with anything more serious than a standard traffic infraction. But Carl Bunchan's mindset was far from routine. In his paranoid state, he believed that the traffic stop was actually an attempt to arrest him on his outstanding parole violation. The reality was that Officer Irby had no knowledge of Bunchan's identity or his legal status. This was simply a traffic stop that had nothing to do with Bunchan personally. As Officer Irby continued his conversation with the driver, Bunchan made a decision that would destroy multiple lives. He exited the passenger side of the vehicle, carrying his loaded revolver. Without warning, without provocation, and without giving Officer Irby any chance to respond, Bunchan raised his .357 revolver and fired a single shot into the officer's head. The shot was fatal, and Officer Irby collapsed to the pavement, mortally wounded. But Bunchan wasn't finished. As the 37-year-old officer lay dying on the ground, Bunchan walked around the vehicle and fired 2 more shots into Irby's back. These additional shots were unnecessary from any perspective. They were simply acts of vicious brutality against a man who was already dying. The witnesses to this horrific act were stunned. They had just watched an execution carried out in broad daylight against a police officer who had been doing nothing more than his job. Immediately after shooting Officer Irby, Bunchan began firing at the bystanders who had witnessed his crime. His paranoia and desperation had transformed him into a threat to everyone in the area. The witnesses, rather than fleeing in panic, showed remarkable courage in the face of mortal danger. One witness, Elmore Bro, made a critical decision that would help ensure Bunchan's capture. Instead of running for cover, Bro ran to Officer Irby's motorcycle and used the radio to call for help. This quick thinking meant that other Houston police officers would receive immediate notification of the shooting and could respond rapidly to the scene. Another witness, Richard Castillo, displayed equal bravery by picking up Officer Irby's service weapon and using it to hold the driver, John Killingsworth, at the scene until backup officers arrived. These citizens understood that their actions could mean the difference between the killer escaping and being brought to justice. Bunchan, meanwhile, was attempting to flee the scene on foot while continuing to pose a danger to anyone he encountered. His shooting spree didn't end with Officer Irby's murder. As he ran from the intersection, he attempted to carjack a vehicle by pointing his gun at the driver who was stopped at a stop sign. When this failed, he continued his desperate flight. During his escape attempt, Bunchan fired shots at another police officer who had responded to the scene. The pursuit didn't last long, thanks to the quick response of both citizens and police officers. Bunchan's path led him to a nearby warehouse, where he was eventually cornered by responding officers. The building provided temporary shelter, but it also became a trap from which there was no escape. When confronted by police at the warehouse, Bunchan made the decision to surrender rather than engage in the shootout he had previously claimed he would prefer to returning to prison. Perhaps the reality of facing multiple armed officers sobered him, or perhaps he realized that his situation was hopeless. Whatever his reasoning, he gave up without further violence. The Houston Police Department's response to Officer James Irby's murder was swift and comprehensive. This wasn't just another homicide case. It was the killing of one of their own, and it demanded the full resources and attention of the department. Within hours of Bunchan's arrest, detectives had begun piecing together not just what had happened, but why. The physical evidence from the scene painted a clear picture of the crime. Officer Irby's motorcycle remained where he had positioned it for the traffic stop, and investigators could trace the sequence of events through the positioning of shell casings, blood evidence, and witness statements. The .357 revolver used in the killing was recovered, and ballistics testing would confirm that it was the weapon that had fired the fatal shots. But the investigation quickly revealed that this crime was about more than just a traffic stop gone wrong. As detectives delved into Carl Wayne Bunchan's background, they discovered a criminal history that spanned decades and included increasingly serious offenses. More disturbing was the discovery of Bunchan's stated intentions regarding police encounters. During interviews with associates, investigators learned that Bunchan had told people he would rather engage in a shootout with police than return to prison. This wasn't just a casual comment. It was a warning that had gone unheeded, with fatal consequences. The investigation also revealed the personal motivation that may have driven Bunchan's actions. Detectives learned about the death of Bunchan's twin brother Kenneth, who had been killed in a shootout with police officers in April 1971. Kenneth had sustained over 8 wounds during the confrontation at an apartment complex in northwest Houston, and Carl had reportedly vowed to avenge his brother's death. This revelation provided investigators with a motive that went beyond simple fear of returning to prison. Bunchan's attack on Officer Irby may have been the culmination of nearly 2 decades of hatred toward law enforcement, triggered by the traffic stop that he feared would lead to his arrest. The investigation also focused on John Earl Killingsworth, the driver of the vehicle that Officer Irby had pulled over. While Killingsworth was charged in connection with the heroin found in the trunk of his car, investigators determined that he had no foreknowledge of Bunchan's intentions and had not participated in the officer's murder. Within days of the crime, investigators had developed a comprehensive understanding of both the immediate events and the broader context that had led to Officer Irby's death. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses had seen Bunchan shoot the officer, the murder weapon had been recovered, and Bunchan himself had been arrested at the scene. The investigation's findings would form the foundation for the prosecution's case. The murder of Officer James Irby sent shockwaves through Houston that extended far beyond the police department. The funeral arrangements reflected the magnitude of the loss felt by the community. Second Baptist Church on Woodway was packed with at least 4,000 citizens and uniformed police officers who came to pay their last respects. For Maura Irby, the shock of becoming a widow at age 29 was compounded by the realization that she was now a single mother to 2 very young children. Cody was just 3 years old, and Callie was only 1 year old when their father was murdered. They would grow up without memories of the man who had been so excited about being present for their ball games and father-daughter dances. Before we step into the courtroom, where prosecutors laid out their case piece by piece, pause for a moment. If you're new here, this is No Way Out, where we take the darkest cases apart so you can see every detail for yourself. Real stories, real consequences, and no shortcuts. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you don't miss the cases we break down next. Now, back to the trial, where the state of Texas began building its case against Carl Wayne Bunchan. The prosecution of Carl Wayne Bunchan for the murder of Officer James Irby began with what seemed like an overwhelming advantage for the state. The crime had been witnessed by multiple people, the murder weapon had been recovered, and the defendant had been arrested at the scene. But the path to justice would prove to be longer and more complicated than anyone could have anticipated. Harris County District Attorney Johnny Holmes was tasked with prosecuting what had become the highest-profile murder case in Houston. Holmes understood that this wasn't just about obtaining a conviction. It was about sending a message that the murder of a police officer would be met with the full force of the law. The case would be prosecuted as capital murder, making Bunchan eligible for the death penalty. However, the intense media coverage surrounding the case created an immediate challenge. The murder of a police officer in Houston had generated extensive news coverage, and potential jurors throughout Harris County had been exposed to details about the crime and the defendant. This level of publicity made it difficult to find jurors who could evaluate the evidence objectively without being influenced by pretrial coverage. The defense team, led by attorney Alan Tanner, recognized the publicity problem and filed a motion for change of venue. They argued that it would be impossible to find a fair and impartial jury in Harris County, given the extensive media coverage and the strong emotions surrounding the case. The motion was successful, and the trial was moved to Fredericksburg in Gillespie County, approximately 200 miles west of Houston. In October 1990, jury selection began in Fredericksburg. The prosecution needed to find jurors who could not only evaluate the evidence objectively, but who could also consider imposing the death penalty if the evidence warranted it. This requirement eliminated many potential jurors who had moral or religious objections to capital punishment. The defense faced the challenge of defending a client who had been caught essentially red-handed committing a brutal murder. Their strategy couldn't focus on denying Bunchen's guilt. The evidence was too overwhelming. Instead, they would need to focus on the penalty phase of the trial and try to present mitigating factors that might convince a jury to impose life in prison rather than death. The trial of Carl Wayne Bunchen began in January 1991 in Fredericksburg, Texas, nearly 7 months after Officer James Irby's murder. The prosecution, led by Harris County District Attorney Johnny Holmes, faced the task of proving what most observers considered obvious, that Bunchen had committed capital murder by killing a police officer in the line of duty. The state's case began with the eyewitness testimony that would form the foundation of their argument. Multiple witnesses took the stand to describe what they had seen on the evening of June 27, 1990. Their accounts were consistent and devastating for the defense. Witness after witness testified that Officer Irby had conducted himself professionally during the traffic stop, showing no signs of aggression or unusual concern. The ballistics evidence supported the witness testimony perfectly. .357 revolver recovered at the scene was confirmed to be the weapon that had fired the fatal shots. The trajectory of the bullets and the positioning of the shell casings corroborated the witnesses' accounts of how the shooting had occurred. The defense team faced an almost impossible task. The evidence of Bunchen's guilt was overwhelming, and their client had been arrested at the scene with the murder weapon. Their only real hope was to convince the jury that Bunchen had acted in what he genuinely believed was self-defense, even if that belief was unreasonable. Defense attorney Alan Tanner argued that Bunchen thought Officer Irby was reaching for his weapon and had fired in response to what he perceived as a threat to his life. The trial proceeded efficiently, with both sides presenting their evidence in a straightforward manner. There were no significant surprises, no dramatic courtroom confrontations, and no last-minute revelations that changed the trajectory of the case. The evidence was what it was, and it pointed inexorably toward Bunchen's guilt. The jury deliberated for just 34 minutes before returning with their verdict. On January 24, 1991, Carl Wayne Bunchen was found guilty of capital murder in the death of Houston police officer James Irby. With the guilt phase of the trial complete, the focus shifted to the penalty phase, where the same jury would decide whether Bunchen should be sentenced to death or life in prison. The penalty phase of Carl Wayne Bunchen's trial began immediately after his conviction for capital murder. The prosecution argued that Bunchen represented exactly the type of criminal for whom the death penalty was designed. They presented evidence of his extensive criminal history, which included multiple convictions for burglary, property damage, drug possession, and sexual assault of a child. They emphasized that Bunchen had been free on parole when he committed the murder, showing that previous attempts at rehabilitation had failed. More importantly, the prosecution argued that Bunchen would continue to be dangerous if allowed to live. They pointed to his statements about preferring to shoot it out with police rather than return to prison, his alleged vow to avenge his brother's death, and the calculated nature of his attack on Officer Irby. They argued that someone capable of executing a police officer during a routine traffic stop would always represent a threat to other inmates and prison staff. The defense was able to present some evidence about Bunchen's troubled background, but they were limited in how they could ask the jury to consider this evidence when making their sentencing decision. After considering the evidence and deliberating on these questions, the jury answered affirmatively to the special issues required for a death sentence. On January 24, 1991, the same day he was convicted, Carl Wayne Bunchen was formally sentenced to death for the murder of Officer James Irby. Following the affirmation of his conviction and death sentence by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals in 1995, Carl Wayne Bunchen began the complex process of challenging his sentence through habeas corpus appeals. These appeals would consume more than a decade and ultimately lead to a surprising development that would give him a second chance at life. Bunchen's initial constitutional challenge was filed in 2003 and focused on claims that his constitutional rights had been violated during the trial process. His attorneys argued that he had received ineffective assistance of counsel and that various procedural errors had occurred during his prosecution. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed these claims and denied relief in November 2003. However, legal developments in death penalty law were creating new opportunities for defendants like Bunchen. The U.S. Supreme Court had been refining the requirements for how juries could consider mitigating evidence in capital cases, particularly in cases involving defendants with mental health issues or histories of childhood trauma. In 2009, Bunchen's lawyers tried a different approach that would finally work in their favor. They argued that something important had gone wrong during his original 1991 trial. The problem was with how the jury was instructed to make their decision about his punishment. During the 1991 trial, Bunchen's defense team had presented evidence about his horrific childhood, the severe beatings, the violence he witnessed, and the mental health problems these experiences had caused. However, the jury wasn't given clear guidance on how to properly weigh this information when deciding whether Bunchen should live or die. The lawyers explained that while this evidence about Bunchen's background had been presented to the jury, the judge's instructions were confusing and didn't give the jurors a clear way to factor in these important details. It was like giving someone all the ingredients for a recipe, but not telling them how to put them together. The defense argued that every person facing the death penalty has the right to have a jury properly consider evidence that might explain their actions or make death seem like too harsh a punishment. This could include things like childhood abuse, mental illness, or other circumstances that shaped their life. In Bunchen's case, this evidence was significant. Expert witnesses had testified about his mental health conditions, and family members had described the extreme violence and poverty he experienced as a child. The lawyers argued that if the jury had been properly instructed on how to consider this evidence, they might have chosen life in prison instead of death. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed Bunchen's constitutional appeal and found that it satisfied the requirements for relief. This meant that while his conviction for capital murder would stand, his death sentence was vacated and a new jury would have to determine his punishment. The decision represented a major development in the case and meant that Maura Irby and her family would have to endure another trial focused on whether Bunchen should be sentenced to death or life in prison. In 2012, more than 2 decades after Officer James Irby's murder, Carl Wayne Bunchen faced a jury for the second time to determine his punishment. The retrial was necessary because the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals had found that his original death sentence had been imposed without adequate consideration of mitigating evidence about his background and mental health. The second trial took place in Harris County, as the issues that had required a change of venue in 1991 were no longer considered problematic. However, the passage of time had created new challenges for both the prosecution and the defense. Some witnesses had died, others had moved away or could no longer be located, and memories of events from 1990 had inevitably faded. For Maura Irby and her family, the retrial meant reliving the trauma of James's murder all over again. The family had thought the case was settled in 1991, and having to go through another trial more than 20 years later was emotionally devastating. The prosecution's case remained fundamentally the same as it had been in 1991. They presented evidence about the brutal nature of the crime, Bunton's extensive criminal history. However, the defense was now operating under different legal standards that allowed them to present a much more comprehensive case for mitigation. The prosecution countered that, regardless of Bunton's background, he had made a conscious choice to execute a police officer, and that no amount of childhood trauma could justify or excuse such an act. They maintained that he continued to represent a danger to others, and that his good behavior in prison was irrelevant to the question of whether he deserved to die for his crimes. On March 6, 2012, after considering all the evidence, the jury once again sentenced Carl Wayne Bunchen to death. Following his second death sentence in 2012, Carl Wayne Bunchen's legal team began what they knew would likely be their final round of appeals. The case had already consumed more than 2 decades, and the legal options for challenging the sentence were becoming increasingly limited. However, the passage of time itself would become a central argument in their efforts to save Bunchen's life. Their appeals to federal courts argued that the lengthy delay between sentencing and execution had eliminated any legitimate purpose that the death penalty might have served. They contended that whatever deterrent effect the death penalty might have had was diminished by the decades-long delay, and that retribution had already been satisfied by Bunchen's prolonged incarceration under harsh conditions. In December 2021, they filed a constitutional challenge arguing that executing Bunchen after more than 30 years on death row would constitute cruel and unusual punishment. They emphasized his advanced age and declining health, noting that he now required a wheelchair and suffered from multiple chronic conditions including arthritis, vertigo, and sciatic nerve pain. The challenge was dismissed, but it highlighted the unusual nature of Bunchen's case. At 78 years old, he had become the oldest person on Texas death row, and his physical condition raised questions about the appropriateness of executing someone who could barely walk. In March 2022, as Bunchen's execution date approached, his attorneys made a final request to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles for commutation of his death sentence, or a 90-day reprieve. They argued that the jury's 1991 prediction that Bunchen would be a future danger had been proven wrong by his 3 decades of mostly peaceful behavior in prison. The clemency petition described Bunchen as a frail, elderly man who requires specialized care to perform basic functions, and argued that executing him would serve no legitimate purpose. The petition noted that he had been cited for only 3 disciplinary infractions during his entire time on death row, with none occurring since 1999. The Board of Pardons and Paroles unanimously rejected the clemency request, clearing the way for Bunchen's execution to proceed. As Carl Wayne Bunchen's scheduled execution date of April 21, 2022, approached, the 78-year-old man had become a symbol in the ongoing national debate about capital punishment. Just days before his scheduled execution, Bunchen contracted pneumonia, a serious condition for someone of his age and frail health. Medical experts noted that pneumonia could make lethal injection more painful and potentially less effective. While receiving treatment for pneumonia at a hospital, Bunchen suffered a head injury when the vehicle transporting him back to prison came to a sudden stop. The injury added another layer of complexity to an already complicated case, as his attorneys argued that executing someone with recent head trauma could constitute cruel and unusual punishment. Despite these health issues, Texas officials determined that the execution would proceed as scheduled. The state's position was that Bunchen's medical conditions, while unfortunate, did not constitute grounds for delaying justice for Officer James Irby's family, who had been waiting more than 31 years for closure. During his final week, Bunchen gave what would be his last interview to KHOU 11 News reporter Grace White. In the interview, he expressed remorse for his actions, saying, "Every day for the last 32 years, I have regretted what happened. He acknowledged that he had shot and killed Officer Irby, but maintained his long-standing claim that he had acted in self-defense. Bunchen told the reporter that he planned to spend his final days reading the Bible, reflecting the religious conversion he claimed to have experienced during his decades on death row. He had reportedly distanced himself from his earlier association with the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas prison gang and had embraced Christianity as a source of comfort and guidance. The interview revealed a man who seemed very different from the violent criminal who had executed Officer Irby in 1990. At 78, Bunchen appeared frail and spoke softly about his regrets and his hope that his execution would provide closure for the Irby family. "Maybe by me being executed, maybe they can finally put this thing behind them," he said. His comments to Grace White represented the first time that Maura Irby had heard any expression of remorse from her husband's killer. "That's amazing, because he's never shown any kind of remorse for any of us," she said after watching the interview. The acknowledgement of wrongdoing, coming after more than 3 decades, provided some measure of satisfaction, even if it couldn't undo the damage that had been done. As April 21st approached, final preparations were made at the Huntsville unit, where the execution would take place. Texas officials confirmed that Bunchen's spiritual advisor would be allowed to pray aloud and touch him during the execution, following a recent Supreme Court ruling that required states to accommodate such religious requests. The execution would make Bunchen the oldest person executed by Texas since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, surpassing previous records and highlighting the increasingly lengthy appeals processes that had become common in capital cases. On April 21, 2022, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice prepared to carry out the execution of Carl Wayne Bunchen, bringing to a close a case that had spanned more than 3 decades and fundamentally changed how Texas handled violent criminals and parole violations. The execution would take place at the Huntsville unit, where Texas conducts all of its executions. Maura Irby made the difficult decision to witness the execution of her husband's killer. After 31 years of waiting for this moment, she felt compelled to see justice finally carried out. Her children, Cody and Callie, who had grown up without their father, also planned to attend. Cody had followed in his father's footsteps by becoming a police officer himself, though he had since retired from law enforcement. Outside the Huntsville unit, dozens of motorcyclists gathered to honor Officer Irby's memory. The group included current Houston Police Department motorcycle officers and retired officers from various motorcycle clubs. As Bunchen's execution time approached, they revved their engines in a tribute that could be heard inside the execution chamber, though some witnesses found the display inappropriate. At 6:26 p.m., prison officials began administering the lethal dose of pentobarbital, the powerful sedative used in Texas executions. Bunchen was allowed to make a final statement, which lasted approximately 5 minutes. His words were directed primarily at the Irby family, whom he could see through the glass partition that separated the execution chamber from the witness viewing areas. "I wanted the Irby family to know one thing. I do have remorse for what I did," Bunchen said while strapped to the gurney. "I pray to God that they get the closure for me killing their father and Miss Irby's husband. I hope to see you in heaven someday, and when you show up, I will give you a big hug." He also addressed the friends who had supported him during his years on death row. "To all of my friends that stuck with me through all of these years, I am not going to say goodbye, just saying so long. I am ready to go to heaven, Warden." Barry Brown, Bunchen's spiritual advisor, was present in the execution chamber and placed his right hand on Bunchen's ankle as they prayed together. They recited Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd," as the lethal injection began to take effect. Brown later said that Bunchen was no longer the hard-headed young man he had been in 1990, but had been humbled by the walls and cold steel of prison. Bunchen took a deep breath after the prayer concluded, coughed once, then took 3 less pronounced breaths before all movement stopped. At 6:39 p.m., 13 minutes after the injection began, Carl Wayne Bunchen was pronounced dead. For Maura Irby, the moment was overwhelming. I felt like I took the deepest breath I was able to in the last 32 years. I felt joy, she said after witnessing the execution. However, she also acknowledged the complexity of her emotions. I'm sorry someone died, but I didn't think of him as a person. I just thought of him as a thing, as a cancer on the face of my family. The unprecedented length of time between Bunchen's original sentencing in 1991 and his execution in 2022 highlighted the complexity and expense of the modern death penalty system. His case had consumed enormous resources over 3 decades, involving multiple trials, countless appeals, and extensive legal proceedings that cost taxpayers millions of dollars. For Officer Irby's children, Cody and Callie, the conclusion of Bunchen's case represented both closure and the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. If you're drawn to stories like this, where justice collides with time, where families seek closure, and where the darkest choices leave consequences that last for generations, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. We break down every case into pieces you can follow, so you can decide for yourself where justice ends and where it fails. Real cases, real consequences. This is No Way Out.